Good evening. Welcome to our forum tonight. My name is Spencer Bradford. I am a pastor at Salem Mennonite Church here in Freeman, South Dakota. And I invite you to join with me in prayer as we begin this evening's gathering. Holy Creator, Almighty God, enduring in grace and mercy for all, we gather today to listen, to speak, to ask, and to receive. We pray that you strengthen our hearts and minds and bodies for this time together and for the effort that it requires each of us in our conversations and comments, our listening and our questions, to honor you and your image in our common humanity. We pray this humbly in your holy name. Amen. Thank you all for coming out tonight, for joining us, for your patience with our slight delay. This series, of which tonight is one, is hosted by the Freeman Network for Peace and Justice. For Justice and Peace. This organization was founded by Christian Mennonite communities in this area and grew out of the Mennonites' heavy involvement in relief work around the world. The mission statement for the Freeman Network for Justice and Peace is to discern God's transforming voice in the church through prayer and sharing, to practice the church's prophetic voice in the world through projects that can be done locally and globally, and to discuss possible opportunities for action concerning issues of peace and justice in our community and around the world. Now, though the organization was founded by Christians and based on our church's teachings, we welcome anybody of any walk or tradition who share the same values of justice and peace if they're interested in being involved with our Freeman Network for Justice and Peace. If you are, please leave your name, phone number, and contact information on our sign-in sheet at the back table. There is a clipboard on the resource table where you can write that down for us. We also have a Facebook page that we invite you to like and to share and to follow us on. Our presentation tonight is being streamed live online on our YouTube page, where you'll also be able to see the recording of it later. We will be monitoring the chat feature for those who are watching live tonight. And if any of our virtual audience members have questions or comments, please do ask and share. Our presenter this evening is Shaykh Hamzah Maqbul. He is joining us from Wooddale, Illinois, where he is the resident scholar for the Rabat Institute, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping people try towards a holistic being of mind, heart, and spirit. It is a grassroots initiative focused on education and community-based programs. Shaykh Hamzah was born in Whittier, California, and lived in Southern California until the age of 10 when he moved to Blaine, Washington. After graduating from Blaine High School, he went on to attend the University of Washington and in 2004 completed his Bachelor's of Science degree in biochemistry and a Bachelor of Arts in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. During his study at the university, he was active on campus, serving as the president of the University Muslim Students Association. After 9/11, he was also listed by the University of Washington as an expert on Islam and was invited to address various groups from all walks of life, from universities to high schools to community groups, as well as multiple forms of media, broadcast, print internet. After graduation, Shaykh Hamzah went on to pursue traditional Islamic studies, which took him to a number of countries around the world, including Syria and Egypt, where he studied the Arabic language, as well as Morocco, Mauritania, the United Arab Emirates, and finally, Pakistan. After his return to the United States, Shaykh Hamzah spent 5 years as the resident scholar of the Thar Institute, a nonprofit religious and educational organization based in Seattle, Washington, teaching and delivering sermons and traveling through America promoting knowledge and practice of the traditional Islam. He is also active in issues of social justice and interfaith dialogue. I am glad to introduce you tonight to Shaykh Hamzah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وكفى والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد. I would like to apologize for being late. I absolutely hate being my own wedding, which was culturally somewhat awkward for those of you who are familiar. This mic, if it's not working, I can always just pull this one out and use this. Can we do that? Yeah. It's all good. I feel like I can scream and everyone will be able to hear me. I'm actually good at that. As a fellow preacher, you might be able to. Anyway, there we go. So, I would like to apologize for being late. Apparently, one of the roads that we counted on being open was washed out, and Google Maps didn't understand that. Today is actually the most busy day of the week for a Muslim preacher. It's Friday, so we actually have Friday prayers. So I shot down to the airport, parked my car, and came straight over. So I appreciate your time. I also have to apologize for you having to hear the long bio or introduction. A lot of the things I might say today or tonight may be very foreign to you. They may, in fact, be antithetical to what you've heard on a number of topics. So feel free to not believe anything I say. All I ask is that if something seems off, just write it down and look into it. See, does what this guy, mentioned right now, does it make some sense or not? And my promise to you is I will be very sincere with you. I will be very open with you. I don't want to say blunt, but it may come off like that to some people. Because life is short, already my beard has started to turn white. We need to figure stuff out quickly because we're not here long enough to beat around the bush too much. I wanted to just share a message with you, and it seems that you also wanted to hear it as well. And hopefully some good will come out of this entire process. I was asked to talk about the Muslim presence in the sacred lands, and in particular, if I'm getting this right, if I get it wrong, please correct me right now before I go off on a tangent. In particular, how is it that the Muslim presence in the Holy Land, in Jerusalem, and in the areas surrounding it, how was it that it dealt with other faiths in that, sacred place? Is that about right? How people live together, how did they interact with one another? So, again, I've been a veteran of interfaith type activities. Oftentimes what happens is it turns into somewhat of like a gladiator match, but with Care Bears, and that's good. People should be nice to each other. I'm 100% of a fan of people being nice to each other, being considerate of one another's feelings, and behaving in a non-repellent way. I think it's a good thing. I don't think that it's good that people should be rude or whatever with one another, but at the same time, sometimes you need to say things a little bit more directly in order to get your point across. And I'll give a small example to illustrate what I mean. One time I was sitting on a flight on Southwest Airlines next to a carpenter. I grew up in Blaine, Washington. It's a city of, like, I think now it's up to 4,000, but in those days it was 3,000 people in rural Washington, about 100 miles north of Seattle. So I was sitting next to a carpenter from the same county I grew up in on a flight. And so after a little bit of tension, after 9/11, looking like me on an airplane was somewhat of a tricky experience, and I never changed my clothes. I never tried to fit in. I just said, okay, well, we're going to say our prayers, and whatever happens ends up happening. And so this gentleman was a carpenter, and so we indulged with one another with some small talk, and then he just jumped right into it. He's like, well, you look like you're a Muslim. Can I ask you some questions about your faith? I said, go right ahead, knock yourself out. And he said, well, and then he asked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all these questions. After about half an hour, he says, well, all the stuff you've been telling me has been great, but what about the Quran saying you have to kill all the infidels? And I was like, look, do you, based on our conversation, based on what you've heard thus far, do you think that we take our religion seriously? He says, yeah. I go, on average, the average Muslim and the average Christian that you know, do you think we take our religion relatively seriously compared to the people who maybe you knew from church that used to attend but you don't attend anymore? He's like, no, I think you guys take it very seriously. If our religion told us to kill all the infidels, do you think there would be anyone left in any of the countries of the heartland of Islam? Egypt has a 10% Christian population. Syria has like a 30% Christian population. Palestine, 35% Christian population. Iraq had a 15% Christian population until our military reached there. Now it's drastically lower. Otherwise, Tariq Aziz, who was the prime minister of Iraq under Saddam Hussein's government. I remember in the small town that I grew up in, the science teacher, so he used to teach chemistry, physics, math, etc. He happened to be the son of a missionary who was preaching the gospel in Pakistan, the country that my parents were from. So here I am in an awkward position that my chemistry teacher actually knows my native language. He's a white man who knows my native language, and it would come out in funny times. He was also the soccer coach, so if I didn't run fast enough, he'd tell me off in Urdu. And when someone would be demonstrating an experiment and pour too much sodium hydroxide into the beaker and it got in his hands, he'd start cursing him in Urdu. So here's my science teacher telling the kids in our class, he goes, do you know Tariq Aziz, the prime minister of Iraq? He's a Christian. He celebrates Mass in Aramaic, the native language of Christ. You never even heard it before. Nobody you know has heard it before. Now with the internet, that's not exactly true anymore. But in those days, it was pretty reliably true. They have been there for centuries. If there was any sort of systematic order for genocide or to kill people off, it's possible. It does happen. We have plenty of examples of it happening in the history of humanity. What's now Ukraine, at some point or another, had a majority of Turkic-speaking people. There's very few of them. They're left in Crimea, and they moved there much later on. Spain, at some point or another, had a plurality of Arabic-speaking people. Now they're not there anymore. Sicily, do we have any Sicilians in the house? Every Italian, I don't know, maybe there's not a big Italian population in Freeman, South Dakota. But in Chicago, we have many people who are Italians. And whenever I see an Italian tell me that they're Italian, I say, don't ever say you're an Italian. Say I'm a Sicilian, because I've been to Sicily before. And the Sicilians get very upset if you call them Italians. I say, you should be proud of where you're from. Say I'm a Sicilian. Sicily, at some point or another, had a majority Arabic-speaking population. That's gone now. There are places, there are times in which these types of genocidal, like purges of people, have happened. If something like this was mandated by Islam, do you not think it would have happened in the heartlands of the Muslims, where Muslims dominated basically continuously with maybe a little bit of a break because of the Mongol invasions in the east and a little bit of a break because of the Crusader invasions in the west. And up until World War I, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, I go, let's walk it back. Let's start to think about things a little bit more practically. Do you see why I'm not a big fit in the interfaith gatherings, even though I'm happy to go and I think they're wonderful initiatives? I don't speak bad about them, but sometimes I say things a little bit bluntly in a way that people find awkward, but hopefully it's constructive. So the first question we should ask in order to understand what was the way that the Muslims and Christians lived together in the Holy Land, and Jews as well. I don't know. Maybe it's just my own bias. Does Freeman have a large Jewish population? But there are probably at least some Jewish population, right? There must be at least one or two people. Nobody at all. Anyhow, so you can ask somebody else later on if you don't believe me. We start from before the advent of what we refer to as Islam in modern time, which is after the mission of Jesus Christ. May the peace and blessings of God be upon him. The Roman province of Judea will undergo a great deal of political turmoil, and at some point or another, its semi-autonomous status within the empire is going to be revoked, and it will be crushed by force, and this all culminates in basically all of the practitioners of the old Israelite religion being purged from the land, kicked out. The siege at Masada being a very dramatic last chapter. You should read about it. It's a very important history. The Sanhedrin, the institutions of the old Israelite religion, which no longer exist anymore. It was disbanded. This is one of the reasons, for example, that the Jews now have a lunisolar calendar. They don't have a pure lunar calendar like the Muslims still have. Because in order to have a pure lunar calendar, you have to get together and see, did someone sight the new moon on which day, yes or no? So they had to replace it with an algorithm in order for them to be able to know what the calendar date is without being able to meet with one another, because the Roman government said if the Sanhedrin meets, which is their council of priests and learned rabbis and prophets, that if they were to meet again, that all of them would be killed, which would be a catastrophe unlike other catastrophes, because once knowledge is gone, you cannot relearn it again. That's how revelation works. It's a miracle that you got it in the first place. If you blow it, it's gone. You're not going to be able to go and buy it at Walmart afterward. And so what happens is this is the beginning of the diasporic era in the history of modern Jews. And I make a break between the old Israelite religion, which had a temple, sacrifices. There's a certain set of rituals that no longer exist amongst Jews. And between modern rabbinic Judaism, they have an overlap in the sacred texts that they revere, and somewhat of a creedal overlap as well, somewhat of a legal overlap as well. But in practice, they're very different religions. And so that's the end of that old Israelite religion, where there's a temple, there's a tabernacle, there are sacrifices, burnt offerings, etc. It's all done at that point. And Jerusalem is basically purged of its Jewish population. In fact, the Romans give it a new name, which is Aelia, A-E-L-I-A in English. And it's actually referred to through much of late antiquity as Aelia, because there's nobody there to call it Mikdash, Mikdash anymore. There's nobody there to call it Yerushalayim anymore, because there's no Jewish population there in the first place. The temple is in ruins. And it's in fact a religiously irrelevant town until Constantine's mother sees certain visions and certain dreams, and they send during his reign people to go out and kind of rediscover all of these places of importance to Christians and to Christianity in Jerusalem. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is constructed, and it becomes a pilgrimage site for Christians, but Jews are still not allowed there. Has anyone here been to Jerusalem, the Via Dolorosa and all of these? You see all of this stuff is there. it's from that time that these places are kind of discovered and kind of consecrated, and it becomes a site that Christians make pilgrimage to en masse. Whereas before that, it's not really a place where there's some sort of formal Christian pilgrimage to go to, and there's some sort of inherent tension between two branches of the early church: the branch that used to observe the sacred law of the Israelite religion and give sacrifices and all of these other things, and then the Gentile branch that didn't observe those things. And we know that the former branch, because of the Roman destruction of Judea, it's extinct. It goes extinct. It never comes back. And then the second branch is the one that's still extant to this day. So what happens is, fast forward to the 7th century. The companion of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Umar, who is, I guess, the second in line of temporal succession. As Muslims, we believe the Prophet Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. There's no prophecy after him. There's no revelation after him. But in terms of the state that's constructed of people who live based on the values and the morals of the community that he set up, the second in temporal succession is Omar. The successor before him that intervenes between him and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his name is Abu Bakr. He was short. His reign was very short. It was 2 years or so. And so Omar's reign is something like 8 years. It's a relatively longer reign, and it is, for scholars of the law, any lawyers here? Precedent is very important about the law. What a judge says about a case yesterday, in order to overturn it, it's more difficult to overturn a precedent once it's established. So many of the legal precedents in the sacred law of Islam are set during the reign of Umar. And during this time, the armies of the Muslims will conquer a great deal of territory in all 4 directions of Arabia. In the south, Yemen was not conquered by force. Actually, the Yemenis converted of their own volition. But in the east, there are wars with the Persian Empire. In the west, in the north, there are wars with the Romans and with their client states like Egypt and whatnot, which is a very dry political affair. You don't come up and make a state based on your own values next to Rome or next to Persia and then get left alone. So it was what it was. Well, turns out that the Muslims did relatively well in their fight against both of these old world empires. The Persian Empire will be completely subsumed beneath the political order of Islam, and much of the Eastern Roman Empire, eventually all of the Eastern Roman Empire will also become subsumed under the political order of Islam, except for Constantinople will take a little bit longer than the rest of it. During the time that Damascus is under siege and these cities of what is now considered like the greater Syria, the Levant, if you've heard this term before, are under siege, interestingly, not the political governor, because the political governor of Jerusalem is not really a significant figure neither to the Romans nor to the Muslims. But the Christian patriarch of Jerusalem, meaning the head of the church, he writes a letter to Omar. He says, look, you basically conquered everything around Jerusalem. And we hear that you make peace with people who want to make peace. And so we will surrender the city to you, but based on conditions. And one of the conditions that he gave was that you have to accept the surrender in person. And so the Muslim polity at that time was ruled from a city in the central western part of the Arabian Peninsula called Medina. It's a sacred city. It's the city where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, rests. And so he went from Medina. He was a man who was renowned for his asceticism. He didn't have bodyguards with him. And he used to not only travel lightly, but he would be very upset with his governors and with his commanders, military commanders, for showing extravagance. And so he set out from Medina with himself, one assistant, and one donkey. and they would take turns riding the donkey. One day you ride, one day I ride. So he set out to accept first, out of honor of the sacred city of Jerusalem, because as Muslims we believe in the biblical prophets as well, that they were sent by God. And so out of reverence for David and Solomon, out of reverence for Christ himself, alayhi salatu wasalam, and the old biblical prophets, and the sacredness of the city and the temple that is situated therein, they set out. And it so happened that the day that they arrived in Jerusalem, it was the servants' turn to ride. So all of the dignitaries that greeted them at the gates of the city, they all started kind of talking to him. It took him a little while to realize, okay, this is not our guy. The one who's walking, he's the one that's the leader of the Muslims that we are going to conduct this surrender to. And the terms of that surrender are enumerated in the sacred, the text of the sacred law, the legal text of the sacred law of Islam. And they are essentially a charter for how Muslims would treat people of different faiths as minorities under their rule in different places in the world. It included a right for Christians and Jews to practice their religion, the right for them to keep their places of worship, the right for them to be exempted from parts of the sacred law of Islam that they don't have in common. So, for example, Christians don't consider it to be unlawful in their sacred law to drink. So, for this reason, the compromise is what? Drink in your own homes, in your own spaces, in your own neighborhoods. Don't let it come out into the common space, but as long as it's there, we're not going to send people to go, look after you, who's drinking and who's making wine and who's doing all these things, who's buying it, who's selling it, etc. And there are a number of things that were in that agreement. Some of those things people may look to as inspirational. There's some things that people may not like or think that this is oppressive or repressive or whatever. But the agreement was there, and it endured for at least 1,300 years. And the legacy of that is that we do have these populations, Christian populations that are minorities in Muslim-majority countries. And in fact, if you look at history, many of the countries we think of as Muslim-majority countries, including Palestine, the process of Muslims becoming a majority in those countries is a centuries-long process, and it's a gradual process. There's not one thing that happened. We have this idea in Islam that your intention regarding an act is what defines that act. So if you do something by force, the act is worthless between you and the Lord. Why? Because if you give charity, the money is not what God wants from you. He created the heavens and earth from nothing. You're like, $100 is not going to make a difference to him. But it's the sincerity that he loves. If you give because someone else is watching, then you lost your money and you get nothing with the Lord. And so imagine that if that's the case for $100, that doesn't really buy all that much anymore. What will the case be with someone's conversion? If a person fakes a conversion, it's completely worthless in front of the Lord. And so for that reason, you'll actually see that Muslims live in minority, as minorities in many of the greatest empires that they oversaw in history, not just the initial conquests where the Muslims were minorities in what are now considered to be the heartlands of Islam, like Egypt, like Syria, like Iraq, like even the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, places like this. But even in the later empires like the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire in the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, mashallah, Singapore being connected with Nusantara, like Malaysia, Indonesia, all of these places. And so, at any rate, this agreement they had, it worked, it was intact for centuries, and you see thriving Christian populations in these lands that have had and maintained continuous practice of Christianity in a time where much of Northern Europe, Western Europe will still be worshiping Thor and Odin for centuries after this. This is one of the funny things, like on the internet, people say, oh, like, they believe, Muslims believe in a different God than us. We worship God and they worship Allah. First of all, the word God is not something that originates in any Semitic language, Hebrew, Syriac, Aramaic. It's not there in the Bible. I mean, it's there in the translations of the Bible, but it's not there in the Bible. Secondly, people have been calling God Allah. And if you want to joust me about whether it's used in Aramaic or Hebrew, I think that's itself untenable. But it's been used in vernacular language of Christian Arabs that have been Christian for centuries before any Arab called himself a Muslim. And it's just kind of like a non-issue. And this is one of the reasons I think gatherings like this are important, because there's a lot of static, there's a lot of kind of fake news out there. If you don't like what I have to say or you disagree with it, I'm okay with that, as long as you actually disagree with like what the real content and substance is. But the shame is to listen to people lie and then believe that lie to be true and then to hate one another. This is a satanic trap. At any rate, Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he accepts the surrender of Jerusalem. He's ceremonially given the keys. This treaty is put into writing and is ratified by both parties. Just like right now, I came in and I had to say my afternoon prayers because perhaps this event will spill over into the time for the Maghrib, the sunset, post-sunset prayers. So I had to say my prayers and then we started. I thought I would be here with enough time to say my prayers and start on time, but road issues, right? Just like that, the time for prayer came in before this negotiation was finalized. And so when Umar said, we have to break in this process, I have to go say my prayers, they offered him a place in the church to pray. And being a very sagacious ruler, he politely declined. And when they asked why, he said, because if I pray in this church, the people who come after me are going to turn it into a mosque. It's going to be a violation of the agreement that we made right now. And so he went out of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and prayed in a particular place, and that's the Mosque of Umar. That's like the main mosque in the Christian quarter of Jerusalem to this day. Much of it, because there's tight space, so much of it actually goes underground. There are levels of it that go deeper and deeper into the earth. But this was the level of concern he had, that the agreement should be kept. You have to understand, as a fundamentalist Muslim, right? Part of our preaching, because Christians are not the only missionary religion that want to preach the gospel. By the way, I had a friend. He was a senior when I was a junior in high school. We were on some of the same sports teams, and I kind of, he was good at math. I was good. We were in the same math class, etc. I'm Brandon Workentine, very solid German name. I remember he was a Mennonite. I don't know if he belonged to the same branch of the church as you or not. It's been since 1999 that I've seen men, or 98 maybe, right? I remember one time we were driving to a soccer match, and he said something. He said, I don't want to be rude or nothing, but we believe you guys are all going to hell. And all of a sudden, the other players they started getting down on him. I said, stop. I said, you know what, at least I trust him because he's telling the truth. If he actually believes that, then if he had any concern for me, he would try to get me out of this situation. We may disagree, but I at least appreciate the genuineness, right? So from my side, appreciate this as well when I say this, that part of the reason Omar was concerned that this agreement should be adhered to is that what kind of people are we? What will you say? What kind of prophet is this man behind these people? If they made an agreement and it was just opportunistic, and when they were in a position of power, they put their hand on everything, and they reneged on their old agreement. So if you like the agreement or you don't, that was two other parties that lived centuries ago that agreed to it. But my claim, and you can go look it up if you agree or not, is that the agreement was largely kept by Muslims. And if anyone broke that agreement, which was broken at times in the history of Islam, the breaking of the agreement would always be met with very strict rebuke by the scholarly class of Islam. We don't have a priestly class, but we have a scholarly class, people who preserve the knowledge of the sacred law and the sacred creed. An example, Sultan Ahmed III, he's an Ottoman emperor. The Ottoman Empire was a formidable force in its day. He lost a large naval battle with the Dutch. Any Dutch people here? My older brother-in-law is from the Netherlands. So, in a fit of rage, he said, burn every church in Istanbul to the ground and kill all the Christians. The Shaykh al-Islam is a cabinet position, the chief, basically Muslim scholar in the realm. There are 4 main cabinet positions. The emperor was like the figurehead. There was the chancellor of the exchequer, which keeps the money, the prime minister, which does all the stuff the sultan doesn't want to do personally, and then there's the Shaykh al-Islam, the chief justice of the empire. He politely said in the gathering to the sultan, he says, tell the scribe not to write this down, because if he writes it, I'm going to have announced at the next Friday prayer that everybody's covenant with the emperor is null. And so he just had to quietly walk it back. Why? Because we take this agreement seriously. What happened after the agreement was signed? Everyone penned cheers. They celebrated their agreement. The first thing that Omar did after being done with this official business, he asked, "We're in Jerusalem. Where is the place? Where is the place where Solomon built his temple?" They said, "Oh, that? You want to go visit the Jews, their place?" He says, "Yes." So they took him to rubble and garbage. And you have to understand, they're Christians, but at the same time, they're also Romans. And Rome won a mighty victory over Judea. And it was a source of pride for them. And so not only was it still rubble, but they used to throw their garbage. It was the garbage dump of the city. And visibly in anger, he made a comment that this is very fortunate for you that we penned this agreement before I saw this. And so what he did was he quietly, in his anger, he rolled up his sleeves and started picking up the garbage and moving it to the side, and the rest of the Muslims who were part of his entourage followed suit with him. And the rubble was cleared, and the site was reconsecrated. Now, there's no Jews like within hundreds of miles of this place at this point, rabbinic or Israelite or whatever. And so the place is reconsecrated and rededicated into a place of worship, and it becomes the central mosque of Jerusalem, which is what it is to this day, with the interruption of something like 90-something years during the Crusades. And Omar commanded that the Jews of the diaspora be allowed to settle back in, and sponsored, I think something like 300 or 700 families should be on the state exchequer sponsored to move back in, and all the rest of the Jewish community from wherever the Muslims rule, they have the right to come and visit this place, and they can move here if they want. And so there is a Palestinian Jewish community. It's obviously dwarfed by the modern Zionist project in terms of Jews, but there are Jews that were there before, that are there from before, the British took over. General Allenby took the surrender of the Ottoman garrison of Jerusalem from the Ottoman Empire, and then it formally is removed from Muslim rule again. But from that time until this time, there has continuously been a Muslim presence. Now, one of the things I mentioned, I forget, we had like a Zoom meeting, like to plan this out, or I think there were four people in that Zoom meeting. Were anyone from that Zoom meeting here right now currently? Okay, awesome. So one of the things I mentioned in the Zoom meeting is that things I say are probably gonna like spark off all kinds of like different questions. And trust me, I have a remarkable capacity to speak for inhuman lengths of time. And right now I'm really trying to make the content light and not dense. Otherwise, I lecture for 8 hours and 10 hours on like legal and creedal topics, and it'll send a person to the grave before they get sent to the grave. So I said, you know what? Why don't we try to put something out there, say a couple of things. It's not going to be everything I want to say on the topic or anywhere close to it, but let's say a couple of things and then open up the discussion to questions and answers. If people are interested but they don't have questions, I can definitely fill in a lot more detail. If people have questions and answers, or questions and want to have a discussion, that's what I'm here for. My flight is at like 5:50 in the morning in Sioux Falls. This is what I'm here for. If you want to stay, I'll stay until everybody's like said what they wanted to say or asked what they wanted to ask. And if that's not enough, I'll come back next week. And if people are bored, then why waste a perfectly beautiful Friday evening? But the last thing I wanted to mention is that the Crusades actually were a very interesting part of both Muslim history and European history, but in very different ways, in ways that are not like mirror images to one another. The thing I wanted to mention was this, is that the word crusade implies what? It's the war of the cross. That this is a Christian war that the Christians are fighting against Muslims or against non-Christians, because a significant number of the people slaughtered during the original conquest of Jerusalem were Jews. From the Muslim side, the word salibi is a relatively modern word. Salib is the word in Arabic for, any Arabic speakers here? Any Hebrew speakers here? Okay, I'm going to then try to walk back the linguistical analysis. But the point is that the literal translation of the word, crusade, would be like Harb al-Salib or Harb al-Salibiyya, the war of the cross, or the people who carry the cross. That's not what the Crusaders were called in Arabic. The Crusaders, what were they called in Arabic? They were called al-Frinja, meaning what? The Franks. Franks, basically Germanic-speaking people. Why? Because we have in the Muslim lands Christians from like day one. And even politically speaking, the Muslims differentiated between the Christians that they lived amongst their ranks for centuries, that largely were people of learning, that largely were people of crafts, that largely were businessmen, were people who were people who were integrated into their society, even if they didn't have the same religion. Whereas the understanding was that the Franks were people who came from a faraway land, where inheritance wasn't shared equally amongst children, where this idea of a person being like a free citizen didn't exist. You're either part of the church or you're part of the clergy or you're a serf. There's all these issues that they came with, and these are the people, these are the enemies that we're going to fight. And this is why when Jerusalem was conquered by the Crusaders, who I don't really, to be honest with you, I don't think it's fair to consider them as representative of Christianity or of Christians. The Catholic Church, maybe you can make some sort of argument, although even then there's some discussion that can be had. But as Protestants, if I say, well, why did your people do this? You'd be like, look, we had issues as well, and we're not, that whole logic, that whole system, we abandoned it a long time ago. This is one of the reasons why when the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem, the narrow alleyways, winding alleyways of the old city were filled with blood at points, to the point where they came to the bridles of horses. And if the Muslim chroniclers wrote it, they would have been accused of bias, but you read these things from the Christian chroniclers themselves. And the Masjid al-Aqsa, ironically, the Temple of Solomon, which houses within it the holiest of holies, was turned into a stable. And when Salahuddin Ayyubi conquered or reconquered the sacred city of Jerusalem, churches were open that week. It was not a disruption in the old system. Again, the point of this not to say that Muslims and Christians haven't had epic violence between them throughout our histories. No, it's definitely happened. Read the history of Andalusia, read the history of Sicily, read the history of North Africa, read the history of Cyprus. Really epic amounts of violence, to the point where violent people would be like, wow, that's very violent. However, the point that I want to make is that from the side of the Muslims, it wasn't because Christians are Christians. And I think that it's also something that I would accept as reasonable from the other side if they were to say that to me. Why? Because if the purpose of like every Christian was to kill every Muslim in the world, then like why would, like you could find another doctor other than this guy, and you can find something else to do on Friday night other than talk to me. Like that, there's too much data that's there to disprove this hypothesis, which is being peddled on the American people because of a particular political agenda as we speak, and it doesn't reflect any sort of reality. Rather, Muslims and Christians have a long history of cultural exchange, civilizational exchange, of living with one another, of getting along with one another, of benefiting from one another. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you know who keeps the keys to the church? Right, the different factions that have the different parts of the church, to this day, you can read, around Easter time, monks will get into like fights, like with broomsticks. They'll like throw down because of their inability to get along with one another. By the way, Muslims do this type of stuff as well, so I'm not trying to like say we're better than you, but every human being has this inside of them. The point I wanted to mention is that the keys to the church were entrusted to a Muslim family for centuries. And the same family still keeps the keys. And the keeper of the keys basically goes to the Fajr prayer, the dawn prayer, and after he's done with his litanies after the dawn prayer, he walks over to the church and unlocks it. And then when he's on his way to the Maghrib, to the sunset prayers, post-sunset prayers, he'll close it again. Why? Because they trusted him. If the point of some sort of authentic Islamic teaching, the Islam of people who fast the month of Ramadan even when it's summer, the fast of the religion of Muslims that doesn't drink and doesn't do drugs, or will take a very hard stance that may be almost alien to modern Western people to this day about like fornication and illicit relations between men and women outside of a very traditional definition of marriage. It's those same people that hold on to those things so firmly as if the rest of the world doesn't exist. But in this thing, they're going to be laxed somehow or another. There's a secret conspiracy to kill all the Christians, but they somehow forgot to do it because they're, too busy shopping at the mall or something like that. This is a hypothesis. The data doesn't fit it. The reality has certain things that are upsetting. It has certain things that are inspirational, and has a lot of things that are really interesting that we can benefit from if we bother to look into it and read into it. But this is not what's happening now. It's not what was going on before. And, sadly, more churches in Palestine have been destroyed in the last, since 1947, than have been destroyed in several centuries from before, probably since the time of the Crusades. These are objective facts. Whoever tries to hide them for you is doing so because of a particular agenda. And I also am not free of an agenda, so if you want to figure out what mine is, please look up all of these things, ask questions, and do your own research. Feel free not to believe what I'm saying, but I came here out of the sincerity of my heart in order to share this story with you, because the implications of it are very dire. And the reason we're all here together is not only because we want to have a cultural exchange. Sadly, there's like large amounts of violence occurring in those lands that are supposed to be the most sacred. And if it's unacceptable to throw dishes inside your mother's house, then imagine to walk into the temple of the Lord and to fire shells at one another and white phosphorus and all these other things. This is a sacrilege, and all of us should be able to agree about that. That the misunderstandings with regards to these things are being manipulated and being taken advantage of in a wrong way in order to justify and perpetuate and increase that violence. And we're on the cusp of an increase of that violence as we speak. And so I was told my job is not to talk about that violence right now, so I'm not going to talk about it, but only mention it in order to say that this is why it's important that we, with some urgency, look into these things right now, lest we participate in something that is odious and obnoxious to the Lord, because this world is only a couple of days, and when it's over, it's over, and it will abandon you much quicker than you think. If you don't believe me, go ask the president from 48 hours ago, like this, this material world, how much wafa and how much loyalty has it shown him? And if it's like that for the people at the highest echelons of power, how about for regular folks like you and me? We're all going to enter into our graves sooner rather than later, sooner than we think. And at that time, the only thing we can take with us is who we've been as a human being. And the only one we have to answer to anymore, it's not the government, it's not your friends and your peer group or whatever. The only person you have to, even the Christians who believe that because of grace, I'll be saved from all of my sins. You still have to show your face in front of the Lord. Imagine if you did something embarrassing, how will that feel like on that day? The fact that he forgave you means that it should be even more embarrassing. You should be even more shy to show your face in front of the Lord on that day. I would be shy about any number of things. Participating in like the killing of children or whatever is definitely not what I want to have on my list on the day I have to show face, whether the children are of whatever, wherever they're from. Kids are kids. So that's why this was worth my time. So I'd like to open it up for questions if people have them, and hopefully we can take it from there. Feel free to ask like pointed and abrupt questions. That's why they called me. The bunny rabbit imam or whatever that's going to like start crying if you say something like, ask a question. But ask what you want to ask. Ask what you want to know about.
Charity Ortman. So I'm just wondering what year you were talking about when Oman or Omar?
Omar with the R at the end.
Was that like 1300s when?
So we're looking at the 7th century, so it's like 6 something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some of those stories or something made me think of a book I read about Genghis Khan and taking just the influence he had and his armies had over that region of the world. And again, I don't really know the bias of that book I read, how it compares to a lot of other points of view, because I have not read a lot about Genghis Khan, but that his influence to his priority, or how do I say this? His priority of family or religion wasn't as important as long as you were following him. So he wanted all the religions to get along as long as he was still getting his goods. I think that was later, but so most of your talk today about when the rules were established, that was about 700. Is that
7th century, so 600 before 700. Yeah. Yeah, and while people are formulating their next question, because I love history, I actually took a tour group to Uzbekistan, to Central Asia, like last month. You mentioned something about Genghis Khan, who's definitely not a Muslim, although you might know a Muslim with the last name Khan now, but that's after a lot of stuff has happened over the centuries, that he wanted all religions to get along as long as you obeyed him. This is something important for everybody to keep in mind. People think that we live in a secular order. There's no such thing as a secular order. Every state has a religion. Some states say, well, our religion isn't a religion, right? Like Muslims, if you ask a Muslim, we'd be like, yeah, Christ is a Muslim, David and Solomon are Muslims, Adam was a Muslim, the dog across the street is a Muslim. We'll say that to you because we understand and we believe our religion to be universal, based on some sort of universal reality that undergirds all of existence. You might be like, yeah, no, you guys are Muslims, you pray on Friday, we don't go to your mosque, and good for you, but we don't accept that. Every political order has a religion. Every political order has a creed. Every political order has certain lines that you are not allowed to cross that are like blasphemy. Every state is defined by a group that claims a monopoly of violence within a particular territory. This is not a particularly inspirational definition of a state, but it is a very accurate definition of a state. So when people say, oh, Islam was spread by the sword, Islam, look at the violence, look, they punish adulterers, they punish this, they punish that like this, and oh, how violent it is, and they, look, oh my God, they executed a woman, and this and that. Okay, every individual situation, you can evaluate and see, do you agree with it, do you not agree with it? The point is that there is a line in which there's no person, man, woman, child, whatever, designator that they have, that they're not going to be able to like not cross a particular line and meet with the violence of the state. It's kind of a necessary evil unless you're an anarchist in the political sense. And so, yes, Genghis Khan had this order. Interestingly enough, the early Mongols, Genghis Khan himself practiced basically their native Mongol shamanism, which believed in a kind of like a one sky god and a bunch of like a pantheon of like lesser deities that they used to worship, and like they used to ancestor worship in nature and things like that. But the Mongols rapidly embraced, the early Mongols were split pretty evenly between Christianity and between Buddhism. It took a little bit over a century before the first major Mongol nobleman will accept Islam. But then after that, what happens is kind of the tide moves in that direction. But it's interesting you mentioned that. I thought that would be like interesting. People would find that interesting, like Hulegu and like some of the most notorious Mongol commanders. Actually, they were either Christians themselves or their wives were Christian. And so in the beginning, Islam was actually it was somewhat of a liability living under Mongol rule to be a Muslim. The central mosque of Bukhara, which is a great city in what's now Uzbekistan in Central Asia, the only part of the central mosque of Bukhara, or really the entire city that still survives from the desolation of Genghis Khan, is the minaret of the Friday Mosque, because they said there are two things Genghis Khan liked about it. One was that it's so tall that you can see for miles around, so it was used as a military like watch post. And the second was that he said this is where the executions will happen. The Mongols actually saw the Muslims are very like particular about their sacred law, so he says the Mongols, we should have a sacred law as well. So they had it codified during his reign. It's called the Yasa. It's something like 300 something odd different ordinances, but only one punishment for violating any of them, which is death. So they used to use it for executions. But yeah. But from one point of view, it's very, very tolerant. We want all the religions to get along, but at what cost? You don't have all the religions get along, you just have them all worship the state, which is, it's very interesting because I come to interfaith type gatherings, and people are very surprised at how Republican I am sometimes. And I'm not Republican in the sense of like, Bill O'Reilly, or you can tell I haven't watched TV for a long time. I'm not Republican in that sense, but some of these things I do see that people who, even within my own community, are from a very different part of the political spectrum. And feel free not to, like any of what I'm saying if you don't like. I won't be offended. I'm just sharing ideas, but I do think sometimes people, sometimes there's a little bit more in common than we think. That this idea that the state is allowed to subsume the place of family, even that's a bold overstep. For them to subsume religion itself is like pharaonic. And so, but then it's couched in such attractive language sometimes that we, that it's seductive to us. So I would rather be like, look, the Christians don't believe what I believe and they believe I'm wrong, and the Jews don't believe what I believe, they believe I'm wrong, and I might believe the same thing about them. But we know that we're on this ship, together for some time. We have to share it, and we can either like constantly be trying to kill each other and cheat each other and stab each other, which is going to make life miserable for all of us, or we can try to get along on stuff we agree on. Like everybody thinks you shouldn't kill children, everyone agrees that the poor should be housed and fed, and that sick people should get treatment or whatever. All of that stuff, we should just work on that, and the rest of it, we can talk it out.
You brought us up to the 1200s with the Crusades. Would you comment on the visit of Francis of Assisi to the Caliph during that century, and how that led to the expansion of Franciscans in the years following the end of the Crusader rule of Jerusalem?
I'll be honest with you, I'm not really all that learned about that. I don't know if I have much to comment, because it may be a bigger event within the life of Christianity than it may be. Not to discount it, it's an important thing. Obviously, I'm familiar with what you're talking about, but it may not be something that I feel confident speaking about with some sort of authority. I'll say this, for example, not just Francis of Assisi, but even from before, the apologies and the polemics between Muslims and Christians, they're of two very distinct types. One is a type that is from Christian clergy within the Muslim lands. People starting from John of Damascus, who is a very learned, scholar of Christianity and church leader, who also, because oftentimes clergy were men of great learning, so they would get government posts because the rulers would want to, keep them in the Privy Council, run ideas by them because of their learning and their intelligence. So he was a courtier of the Umayyad Caliphate. And so read his polemics against Islam, and then read what the Western Church, where nobody's seen a Muslim and no one met a Muslim. The nearest Muslim is 1,000 miles away. It's like night and day. The word Saracen to refer to Muslims, it's only in the West, first of all, and it's something that's completely a mystery. Where did this word even come from? The word itself, where did it come from? Or the idea in the East that, they'll be like John of Damascus, right? Your prophet can't be from God because he conducted wars. Your prophet can't be from God because he married women, and etc. These were objections that he had, and they're contrary to Christian ideas of holiness, and he made an argument with regards to it. The discussion is based on some sort of factual basis, whereas in the West, the church teaching was that the Saracens worship an idol named Termagant, which is basically a man who dresses up like a woman. Which is remarkably effective from a PR point of view, because everyone who's been to public school, middle school, knows that the easiest way of reducing a person's stature in the eyes of his peers is to say that they're something that we can't say anymore. But it's not based in fact at all. And so yes, obviously once you have to deal with an interlocutor that will say something back to you, it forces you to be better in how you talk to them, how you speak to them. I think that Francis Assisi is important for the Western Church as being an initial contact with the Muslim world, but it's not necessarily representative of Christianity. I'll give you another example, right? The Spanish Inquisition, when Spain was conquered by the Christians, they call it the Reconquista, right? The reconquest. The Muslims are foreigners. They came, they conquered Spain, and then they left. If you look at history, the southern part of Spain, the western part of Sicily, before the Roman Empire, they were traditionally ruled by the Carthaginians. Carthaginians speak Punic, which is the western dialect of Phoenician. It's semi-intelligible with Arabic. So this idea that somehow or another Arabs and Berbers are like foreigners in these lands, I think it's a little bit of an overstretch. And the kingdoms in the south of Spain were Gothic. The kingdoms in the north of Spain were Frankish. They had beef with one another from before. There's a whole heresiology with regards to the Goths were largely practitioners of Arianism. There's the issue there before Islam came in, and there's a conflation. This is the same thing if you go, has anyone here been to the Balkans before, been to Bosnia, Croatia? So the Bosnians, before they became Muslim, who? Someone? Who? Albania. Oh, see, now you're going to start a war in Eastern Europe. Just, yeah. Anyhow, so Bosnians, they were neither, right? The Croatians are Catholics, the Serbs are Orthodox. The Bosnians followed a different church that both the Catholics and Orthodox considered to be heretical, and lo and behold, they become Muslims at some point. And so the beef is not really a Muslim-Christian beef. It's much older than that. I'm sure there's new elements to it later on, but there's something else going on there. The point I wanted to make, sorry for being long-winded, but no one's raising their hands. If you have a question, I'll boil it down really quickly, is that the persecuted groups after the Reconquista in southern Spain were three. Everybody knows that the Spanish Inquisition was not a fan of a person being Muslim. It's not a stretch for most people, if they didn't know from before, that a target of the Spanish Inquisition was also Jews. So they would make people do stuff like eat pork, or if you could rat out your neighbor for taking a shower too many times, or for if you suspect them of the 5 daily prayers or whatever. The third target that people are really not familiar with is that there's a rite of the Catholic Church called the Muasarab rite. It was a Catholic mass sanctioned by Rome that was celebrated in Arabic. If you got busted celebrating mass in Arabic, the Inquisition was going to get you. They were going to take your kids away. You're going to get tortured. It was a problem. And if you don't believe me, go onto YouTube. You see that the Muasarab rite actually finally receives sanction again from Rome, and can finally be openly celebrated again in Spain as of probably the last just decade, maybe 2 decades max. Why? Because there were like hundreds of thousands of Christians who were celebrating Mass in Arabic. The point is that level of kind of communal exchange. It existed between Muslims and Christians for a very long time, but the Western Church, the Catholic Church, and then afterward the Protestant churches that come out of communion with the Catholic Church and go on their own trajectory, they didn't have significant interaction with the Muslims in an impactful way until after the Crusades.
Since no one's asking questions, so the elephant in the room is the violence happening in Gaza and Israel. In your presentation, you gave a lot of references between the Muslim communities and the Christian communities getting along, interacting. Can you tell us a little bit about Muslims and Jews? And also, can you tell us about the Jewish people during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and give us examples of those interactions as well?
So essentially, Islamic law, the same ambit of protections that it affords to Christians, it also affords to Jews. And so always the Christian community, and then later on when the Muslims will interact with different denominations of Christianity and Jewish community and different denominations of Judaism, because there would be a fight between denominations. And so I guess the precedent upheld in the Sharia is that it's reneging on the original agreement to force one type of Christian or to allow one type of Christian to enforce their Christianity on another one. So there's a system of basically, okay, are you a bona fide denomination? If you are, you have your own relationship that's directly with the state and exclusive to the other denominations. Like that, the Jews have essentially the same arrangement. And the Muslims, just like in the early times, in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as well as that of the early successive generations, there was conflict with Christians, there was conflict with Jews. The Muslims fought wars against the Romans. Again, there are a number of dimensions. It's not just like you're a Christian, we're going to go kill you. The fact that the Arabian Peninsula had suffered depredations between the different client tribes of the Arabs, some allied to the Persians and some allied to the Romans, it had a lot to do with it. But the Muslims fought wars against Christians in the early times, and like that, they also fought against the Jews in the early time. But none of it was seen as a religious war, and the proof of that is, again, these protections and this arrangement was extended to Jews as well as Christians. Someone asked, well, what does that mean? A number of the courtiers of Omar himself were Jews. There's a hadith in the Sahih Bukhari. We have a system in Islam for narrating incidents that happened in the past that including narrating the text of what people said and having a chain of narration that I heard it from this person, they heard it from that person, and scrutinizing the chain of narration. Was it possible for these people to have even met one another? Was someone known to be a liar? Was someone known to be a thief? Was someone known to be an upright person? How are they in the position? So you can scrutinize the narrators. Were they even in a position to know what they knew? So the most authentic collection of hadith, of these narrations, it's Sahih Bukhari. Bukhari we mentioned earlier in the question and answers. Bukhari, Abu Ismail al-Bukhari was a compiler of that collection. It's mentioned that one of the people who was on friendly terms with Omar, he was a Jew, and so he says to him one day, he has enough of a friendly relationship with him that he addresses him as the commander of the faithful, Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the believers. I mean, he's a Jew, so he's not one of the crew, but he's familiar enough with them that, he can say that and it's okay. He accepts it, they accept it, they're on friendly terms. He says, there's a verse in your Quran. If it was revealed to the Jews, we would have made that day into a holiday. And so Omar asks him, he says, what is that verse? He says, اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. That this day I have perfected your religion and completed my favor upon you, and I'm pleased that you should come to me in submission. Meaning that sacred law is complete this day. There's not going to be any new rulings that are going to come. And so Omar says to him, he says, I remember the time and the place that verse came down, and it was on a Friday, and it was on the day of Hajj, and it was in Arafat, basically in the most sacred of lands, and so he says that you were saying that you would have taken it as a day of celebration because this was like the most sacred day in the history of Islam to us. The point is that they were not only not killing each other, but they were able to talk to one another about religion without getting offended or without getting touchy or without it being considered disrespectful or blasphemy. And throughout the history of Muslims, Jews have actually fared pretty well in the Muslim lands. Has anyone heard of the name Maimonides before? The Rabbi Musa bin Maymun, they call him the second Moses, which means he's kind of important to them. He actually received a madrasa education in Spain. And I've read the theology books that he read in madrasa, in traditional seminary education. All of his books were written in Arabic except for one commentary he wrote. All the rest, the Mishnah Torah he wrote, it's kind of a distillation of what you need to know about the Torah. He wrote that in Hebrew. All of the rest of his books are all in Arabic. Rabbis read it in translation now. If you had read it in Arabic and then you read Ghazali, you'll see that there's a lot of exchange of ideas going on, to put it very politely, in my opinion. It's a book called Dalalatul Ha'irin. It asks questions like, how can Jacob wrestle with God? It's a perplexing question. How can God have a wrestling match with somebody and also lose? So there's an interpretive apparatus of how to go through things like this that a literalist will understand in a problematic way. And that methodology is largely the same as the methodology developed by Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari in Iraq, a great traditionalist and scholar of of the Muslim tradition. And Maimonides is like, if I only have 30 seconds to tell you, I'll say Maimonides, but there's like a very long list of prominent and notable figures, Jewish figures in the Muslim tradition. Do you know where he was from? He was from Spain. He was part of the generation that lost Cordoba to the Reconquista. And so being a Muslim was bad news. Being a Jew was bad news. So he fled. Where? Did he go to Paris or London? No, he came to the court of Salahuddin Ayyubi. Salahuddin was the great commander of the Muslim armies that conquered or reconquered Jerusalem from the Crusaders. He said that he was such a learned man that he was also a talented and skilled physician. So Richard the Lionheart, who brought a large army from Europe to try to wrest Jerusalem away from the Muslims again, that he fell ill, and out of his chivalrous conduct, Salahuddin Ayyubi sent his court physician to Richard to heal him, because the diseases that were there in the sacred lands the Europeans were unfamiliar with. So who did he send? He sent Maimonides to go and heal him. And their family actually kept the rabbinate. There are a number of really interesting stories about them. Maimonides' son at some point ordered that the benches be thrown out of the synagogue and everyone should sit on the floor, because it's more authentic in his estimation and more close to being humble in the presence of the Lord. The Jews came and complained to the son of Salahuddin and said, he's forcing us to make our synagogues like your mosques are. And so the Sultan calls the rabbi and says, look, either this is the religion that they're accustomed to, and that this is the religion we agreed with them that they would be able to practice. Either bring the benches back into the synagogue, or I'm going to appoint a new chief rabbi. But this is how Muslims and Jews live together. This is how Christians and Jews live together. Can someone say something happened that wasn't wonderful? Oh, they didn't allow this, they didn't allow that. Every state has its own issues that are more oriented to politics than to religion. But this idea that somehow Muslims are out to get the Jews or somehow out to get the Christians, this is not borne out by the data. And so, the fact of the matter is that the Ottoman Sultan, when the Reconquista, basically when Spain falls, the Ottoman Sultan not only gave refuge to the Jews of Spain, but actually the first printing presses that were opened in the Ottoman lands were given as businesses for the Jews, because not only did he allow the refugees to come, they said that your forefathers used to be under the protection of Islam, and so we failed you over there, so you can redeem it with us. He opened these factories so that they have businesses and they have jobs. The Ottomans actually didn't allow the printing presses for Muslims. Why? Because being a scribe is usually the way that the students of knowledge used to make money, like the students of the sacred law, creed and things, traditionalists and things like that. And so has anyone ever here read a manuscript before? It's so different than reading a printed book. People say read between the lines. Have you ever read between the lines in a book before? There's nothing between the lines in a book anymore. Why? Because the interlinear commentaries are not there, the marginalia, the commentaries on the margins are not there. All of that critical apparatus in any book is gone. So if you ask the question of, like, do you know that the text of the Gettysburg Address that you read in high school, is it exactly what Lincoln wrote? Did you know that there are like several printed newspaper editions that are different than one another? How do you reconcile between them? Is one right? Is one wrong? This entire critical apparatus is all there in texts that are copied by scribes, because people figure out that this text is different than that, and then they have to sit down and try to figure out what happened, and they write those things. And there's no easy way of writing it that's easily reproduced by machines, but like when you have a person sitting down and writing those. So this entire thing, he didn't want to disrupt it amongst the scholarly class of Muslims. So I said, here, the Jews, he gave them, he said, print secular works in your printing presses, this is how you can live in the empire and still make a living. People are familiar with the Ottomans sieged Vienna at some point, right? There's a big Ottoman threat, scary Turks about to overrun Western civilization. And, it kind of was, so I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But the history, when told from the other perspective, yields interesting insights. The stated purpose of Sultan Qanuni Suleiman, who they call Suleiman the Magnificent in English, was that he is going to liberate Spain through the overland route because he was not, his navy was not capable of transporting troops all that far. Anyone here read Clausewitz before? The Art of War? Not Art of War, that's Sun Tzu. On War. Clausewitz, right? Like average minds discuss strategy, but like the top minds, they all discuss logistics. So think about what does that mean if we're about to get embroiled in another war halfway across the world. Anyhow, this was what he wanted to do. So he moved the capital from Constantinople to Belgrade, and history is history. But the point is that I want to say antagonism that was there, it wasn't purely just so that there's new conquest. There's a sense of okay, like while the Christians are getting pulled, it was actually in some sense or another something that was being done to avenge the Jews as much as it was to avenge the Muslims. Does that make it right? Does it make it wrong? No. It's important to understand where people are coming from, even when you don't agree with them, especially when you don't agree with them. You don't have to agree with them. You can still say, I don't agree with it. But it's important to understand where they're coming from. And so, yes, the Jews were a really important part of the Ottoman Empire and of the central and the western states. Not as important in the Mughal Empire because you're not going to find many Jews in like India. There was a synagogue in Karachi until the time of Israel, but like maybe in the Muslim lands, that's the furthest east you'll go.
I was interested in your comment that every political entity it has a religion, whether or not it says it does. It also, I agree with that. I also wonder whether each of our faiths may not be most authentic and true to its nature when we are not heir to political power, when we don't have vested interests in political systems. And I mean, I'm out of a tradition which you mentioned, the Mennonites, which basically has seen itself as a countercultural community living in the midst of empires and living a different way, because we don't want that power stuff. And I never visited in Israel, Palestine. I visited a little Muslim village surrounded by Jewish settlers. And they were struggling to keep their life together. Their olive trees were being dug up. Their sheep were being harassed in the fields. Things were just not going well for them. But they maintained their life out of their Muslim faith, and that's what sustained them, and that's what kept them persistent in seeking their place, which was very vulnerable, and maintaining their place. So is it true that we would each do better to follow our own traditions, but to do that apart from the exercise of power and manipulation and force that goes with political life?
So I think as individuals it may be, but piety looks different on an individual level. It looks different on a familial level. It looks different on a communal level. It looks different on a national level. It looks different on an international level. So this is what our tradition teaches us, which models the perfection of one's humanity on the lives of the prophets. And by and large, if you look at the lives of the prophets of the Old Testament, you will see that there was some sort of understanding of the mandate for political order and actually exercising that political order. So I hear a lot that people say absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't think that's true. Personally, I don't think that's true. I'm not here to say that you're wrong. I think the path that you mentioned is definitely spiritually the less perilous path. Which is what? I'll give you an example. As Muslims, we have like a dietary code that we follow. It's called halal. It's why I don't eat a chicken sandwich, Chick-fil-A, right? It's why I don't eat pork. It's why I don't drink alcohol, etc. When I first came back from my seminary education overseas, I went to university in Seattle. It's 100% hippie town. And just like there are certain things that I agree with Republicans about, there are certain things I agree with Democrats and even even more to the left liberals, which has to do with the stewardship of the earth. I personally don't understand why anyone who believes in God would not recycle a can, for example, especially when it's not an onerous thing to do. I don't understand why a person would think that, or would resist, having a car that burns less gas or whatever. These are all blessings of the Lord. We cannot touch God in this world, at least normal people or whatever. But what can you do? You honor him by honoring the gifts that he sends you. So in Seattle, finding vegetarian food, very easy thing to do compared to the rest of the country. So I came back to America. I realized that the halal industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry even in America, is not run very well. And according to whatever I studied in seminary, much of it seems to be just non-halal stuff that's grifted over with halal tags that are easy to put on a box because of the First Amendment. The judge will not intervene. You can say a pork ham sandwich is halal. A judge won't intervene. All the person has to say, well, I consider it halal, and the judge won't intervene. And I think in general, it's good that the judge doesn't tell a Muslim what Islam is, but it can go to weird places. It's not in that sense, it's a system that has, there's some ins and outs to it. So you know what I did? I was like, you know what? I live in Seattle. I'm just going to eat sushi. We have great sushi, and we have great vegan restaurants, and that's what I'm going to do. After my life with the community got more and more involved, and why this law? We believe that you eat something dirty, it makes you a dirty person. You drink the intoxicants, it makes it hard to be a good person. You eat the dirty food, it makes it hard to be a good person. You consume ill-gotten wealth, you're a thief. You steal money from people. You consume that the sin, you're imbibing it inside of you, makes it really hard to be a good person, even if you want to afterward. So I thought, you know what? Vegan, no problem. Then what happens when I worked with the community, I see people with their problems, I see people with their issues, I see them struggling, and I said, you know what, this is not a solution for other people. For me, I have my head on straight. I had this blessing of this education that I received. I know how to hustle around and get what I want. I have no dependents that I have to feed at that time. I'm a tough guy. I can tough it out. But what is the solution for my people? I don't know. And so the issue is that, yes, it's as an individual, it's an easy way to abjure any sort of worldly position, and it's the safer way. And I think for people who know this about themselves, that once they have power inside their hands, once they have money inside of their hands, it's going to make them rebellious against the Lord. That's the path that's superior for them. But there are people, I've seen them in my own life, and our history has shown us people like that they wield unimaginable amounts of power, and through their connection with the Lord, they did a relatively good job, in my opinion. If Omar can, trade turns on the donkey when walking to Jerusalem, when he could have easily overran it without his army, and it would not have been out of place in the time that he lived. Sadly, wouldn't have been out of place all that much even today. at some point or another, someone has to look out for those kids that don't have someone to stick up for them. Someone has to look out for the weak people that have no one to stick up for them. Someone has to, look out for the poor. Someone has to look out for the one who has no one to feed them. Someone has to look out for the orphan that has no one to stick up for them. And in our tradition, we have, there's a hadith, again, a statement attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that the strong believer is better and more beloved to the Lord than the weak believer, even though there's good in both of them. And the idea is what? Is that the lowest level of a person's relationship with the Lord is to recognize what's good is good. I think, in fact, this is a value we share with Christianity. You can be a person who is, from a legal perspective, at least according to the old law, right, objectively a bad person. 10 Commandments, breaking all of them, multiple times a day. But imagine that person is completely addicted to every type of vice, but they sit in the corner and they think about like Christ, and they like say, you know what, I'm a horrible person, but like how wonderful was his example for us? Would you say that this person should be like, thrown into the wood chipper, or would you say there's some spark of goodness in them? So we believe that as well, but that's step one, that's entry level. Step two is to actually fix yourself up in our tradition. Step three is to what? Is to help other people move up the continuum, not down. Now, I totally understand how this is very sweet talk, and there are a lot of very crooked and messed up people who say all of these right things, and then once they get into power, it's all the same garbage they're doing again. But our tradition shows us that that's not always the case, that there are people who stood up for what was right and who didn't care about what people said, and people came at them with all that they had. In some cases, they actually sacrificed. They gave sacrifice. I mean, like an inspirational Christian leader in the last century that's relatively non-controversial, hopefully, Martin Luther King. Now, someone might say, well, he never took power for himself, but a lot of what he did was very political. And if he didn't do political stuff, then no one would have cared. He would not have received the assassin's bullet. Because it is a show of power. It's a show of force to march in Selma. It's a show of force to boycott, what's going on in the bus. Politics isn't just that I'm running for president, now pay me, Politics is everything. Politics is what? Husband and wife come to a wonderful talk on a Friday evening. Husband wishes his wife would pay more attention to him, Why doesn't she kiss me? So he realizes what? If I want something from her, she should get something she wants as well. So he, buys her the flowers she likes, and he buys her the dinner, or he cooks dinner for her, and he does something, and whatever. He does something in order to induce her to do something back. That's what actual politics, that's actually what politics are. You project it through to society, and it gets to interesting places when you do it on a high level. What's another way of politics? I want my wife to kiss me, so I slam her, like a criminal, I slam her to the floor and then give her a kiss on the cheek, right? Politics is conducted in both of these types of ways on a societal level, on a national level, on an international level. Just like the two of these things, one is sweet. You think about, like the ladies are like, yeah, how come you don't like cook me my favorite meal and like, be sweet to me, right? Just like it's something attractive to all of us. We have this idea inside of our heart and we think fondly of it. Just like that, the other example on the international level is happening as well. And sadly, if people who the Lord endowed with strength and endowed with power, even though there are cheaters and jokers and fakers out there, it means that if those people who are endowed with blessings from the Lord and they don't stand up for the weak, they don't stand up for the poor, that makes it even more just like horrible. And we get to a nihilistic place where what's the point of civilization? What's the point of humanity? What's the point of any of this? And, I get to that place myself because I think about what happens in the world and it gets me really depressed. The only thing that saves me from that dark place is the faith in the Lord. That God created the heavens and earth from nothing. He's the one who can do whatever he wants. If he wishes to, he can send his mercy in the form of people. And some of us have experienced the mercy of people like that. This gentleman, I met him for the first time at the airport. He drove me over. I can say something right now, it will make him cry. Has the Lord ever sent you anybody like that just pulled you out? See, he's crying right now. Some of us have had that experience. Maybe some of us are blessed that we've never been in a place where we needed someone's help that badly, and you should really be thankful for that. Maybe, it's a sign you should be that person for another person, but that's my That's my thing. And I think what you said has a lot of truth in it. And if I ever thought that more harm would come out of the work I do than good, or I thought myself like on the precipice, because, man, religious leaders, people trust them because I tell you about God, and then you think of God, you start thinking about me. It's a normal human thing. And what am I? I'm nothing. I'm like a walking garbage can. I'm a horrible human being. And so once you start trusting me, I start abusing your trust. If I got to that place, I swear I would quit my work and rather get a job, at the corner store than be the one who sells out that trust to the Lord. But somebody has to do that balancing act. Otherwise, we're all not gonna be well as human civilization. I'm sorry. I was forced. I'm not trying to shut down you're wrong. No, you have a lot of good points you made.
I have a question. It's kind of getting close to bedtime here, so before we leave with the kids, what do you say to kids, maybe in your community, your family, to kind of explain or what is important for them to know from your perspective about what is happening in Israel-Palestine right now?
So I have definitely a lot of ideas about it that are mine, and I don't even expect you to agree with them, but I think what the Venn diagram, what the overlap is here for all of us, what I would hope, I don't know, I spoke at a protest, the student encampment at the University of Chicago. There was a counter protest. One of the pro-Israeli groups actually sponsored the counter protest by bringing kegs of beer, which made the entire thing even more potentially explosive, which I think is a really low-class move. But at any rate, it is what it is. When I was asked to speak, I said, look, you guys across the quad with like a line of cops between us, we're all on the same team here, okay? I personally have my political views about what should happen in the sacred lands, and you have yours. But we should agree that whatever happens, if a criminal does something, then the writ of the state should, through the legal process, take them to task for it. Otherwise, starving children, bombing hospitals, bombing places of worship intentionally, dropping more tons, not like the weight, but the measure of explosive power, dropping more tons of explosives on Gaza, which is like a 6 to 8 mile wide strip of land, like 13 miles long or something like that, then was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the nuclear bombs. This is 100% a corrupt and horrible thing to do. If you don't agree that Palestinians should have a state, I can deal with that. I don't agree with it, but I can deal with it. But what keeps me up at night, because the Palestine-Israel issue was an issue from before, but I was not as passionate about it, neither were you, neither was anyone, because, things were not beyond a certain point. Now that we see that after about somewhere shy of the 40,000 civilian death count, because there's no functioning hospitals anymore, and the record-keeping apparatuses of state have all been decimated. We don't know how many dead there are anymore because there's no one left to count. Now surgeries are being done without anesthesia, etc. And the wonderful thing is people say, well, what about Hamas? Hamas is just fine. They're in tunnels 50 meters under the ground. They're the only ones who are actually not being harmed by what's happening. And so at that point we have to just say, look, there needs to be another way to get this done without killing children. And if someone wants to say that oh, this is the law of Amalek or whatever, I can't argue with that. I guess then we just have to fight each other to the death, right? But for the rest of us that don't subscribe to that worldview, even those of us who believe, Christians believe in the scripture of the Old Testament being from God, right? But that was a dispensation for a different time and a different place, and it's over now. Even the Jews believe that it's over. It's not something that you can make analogy to. I mean, some unscrupulous preachers now invoke it, but that's not actually good. That's not even good halakhic practice. that we just need to, however we want to deal with it, it needs to happen without me seeing children being burned alive again and again, day after day after day after day. And then the rest of it, politics are going to go on. People are going to struggle for land and control and rights and money and all that stuff. That happens, that will go on. But the killing of children, it's not okay.
Thank you, Shaykh. So we're approaching the close of our gathering tonight, and there's a couple of remarks I need to make since I skipped a page in my introduction, but I did want to make a note of a few things. First of all, that we do have handouts and resources on the back table. You're welcome to take some from there. And there is a donation box also as you leave in order to continue producing sessions like these with guest presenters and events to promote justice and peace. Costs and expenses have to be paid. So please consider making a donation to our organization as you leave tonight. I want to thank the Shaykh for his time here tonight and pray for safe travels for him as he returns and goes on. This has been the second presentation in a 5-part series on the theme Challenging the Myth of the Israel-Palestine Narrative, a community conversation. Our Freeman Network for Justice and Peace believes that the current story about the history of Israel, Palestine, their relationship, and life in those two areas has been in many ways distorted. There is some truth to the story that we receive in the mainstream media and our institutions, but much of the commonly held understanding of the situation is flawed with significant error and untruth. So through presentations such as Shaykh's tonight, we want to try to address such myths and to seek out from different presenters over the next few months a better understanding, to identify misconceptions and to find where there is ground for real disagreement, to achieve greater understanding. So with thanks again to the Shaykh tonight, we will be also distributing soon information about other upcoming presentations as those are prepared and organized, and we encourage you to come back for our next one, or if you're online, to tune in for our next presentation. Thank you all for coming tonight, and have a good evening. Blessings.